Welcome to the What Happens Next YouTube channel. What we're aiming to do with this channel is share content designed to make sure that you're supported through whatever's next in your life. And we'd love to continue to do that. I've got a favour to ask today, and what I'd ask you to do is just subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it really helps us deliver really good quality content on a consistent basis. Thank you, and let's go on to the interview. Hi, and welcome to What Happens Next, the channel dedicated to exploring the challenges we've often faced when we're in our 50s and 60s, thinking about retirement, but realising, actually, I'm not ready for retirement. I want to live the next chapter of my life in a different way, but I'm not sure that old model of learn, earn, and rest applies to me anymore. And it's really interesting because we've got the What Happens Next book coming out soon, and we're doing loads of research with people like you who are approaching this period of your life. And what we're finding is there's a middle ground when people are thinking about retirement where they feel a bit lost. And the idea of the What Happens Next channel is to help you with insights that make you feel a little bit less lost. Now, today we want to talk about financial well-being and money in retirement. And I can't think of a better guest to come on and speak to me about that than Katie. Katie, how are you today?
I'm really well, thank you, Chris. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this chat. So I know who you are, but for the audience who don't, tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I'm Katie Vye. I head up a business called Better with Money. So I guess the main purpose of my role is just to not overwhelm people with spreadsheets and jargon, but just sort of simplify things and focus, on what matters. So our work is really about the human side, I guess, of money, how we think about it, feel, behave around it. And yeah, I guess in reality, most financial decisions aren't logical, they're emotional. So if we can improve that relationship, then everything else tends to follow. So that's me, and that's what we do.
And how do we get better at just having more human conversations about money?
Well, I think typically, if we think about the UK, we are a culture that typically doesn't tend to talk about money. So I think the more of those sort of just good, honest conversations we can have, and removing some of those taboos, whether that's in our own households, in our places of work, then that's what kind of, helps bring that sort of human element to money, because we're all guilty of making some mistakes along the way. And I think the more we can share that, the more it can then help everybody around us as well.
Yeah, 100%. Well, why do you think there's a cultural taboo?
I think it probably stems, from generations back where it just wasn't, it just wasn't a topic of conversation. I think it was probably put alongside religion, politics, money being, one as well, that was very much, that's not a topic of conversation. And I think even, as somebody, I'm 43 currently, and I even think about my relationship, with my own parents. And even now, would I sit at the dinner table with them and ask them about their money? No, I wouldn't, and yet I work, I work in the industry and I work with it all the time, but there's still that sort of, I think, generational difference that is apparent around how people are open, or maybe not, as the case may be. So yeah, I think it's probably a generational thing.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing I'm finding that for the clients that we're talking to at that What Happens Next stage, in there, a little bit older than us, although I'm 48, so I'm a little bit older than you, but a little bit older than us, in their mid to late 50s to mid to late 60s, they're really, they know they need to get to grip with it sort of stuff, but there's a weird relationship with money often, and sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about money can be different. But you talked about a generational shift. How do you think the relationship with money has changed over the years?
Yeah, so I think probably in a lot of my experience, money can be used sort of for status, purposes as well. And I think interestingly, through my observations, the older generation, that typically is what the perception is, that it does provide this level of sort of status, and they're measured on their self-worth by perhaps
Yeah.
where they've achieved and what income they got to and how big their house is and everything else. When I'm now working with lots of the younger generation, that is radically different. And the level of openness that I'm sort of seeing is actually really quite interesting as well, where I think they are far more open around if they've got an overdraft, if they've maxed out credit cards, and that's almost, a sort of measure of their status.
Less of a taboo, right? Less of a
Yeah,
taboo for the younger generation.
definitely. Yeah. So I definitely think we are seeing a shift in how money is sort of perceived and actually, what it's for. And I just think different generations come with different expectations around what they see of money, what they see its use, what it tells them in terms of their place, so to speak, in society, and that's different, from one set to another.
I've been thinking about this quite a lot because I think we're all guilty or responsible for telling different stories about money, right? We tell and how it serves our life. What do you reckon the helpful stories we can tell ourselves about money are, and what are the ones that we should really avoid telling ourselves?
I think probably the mistakes that we make, with money are the really powerful stories to sort of share. And I think particularly when I think about young children and having two young children myself, is quite important to let them make those mistakes,
Yeah,
because I actually do think that's when the greatest learning comes.
yeah,
And I think that's actually when we see the greatest sort of engagement and buy-in. So I think maybe the stories I'd typically tend to avoid would be the classic where everything's just gone really well for somebody, financially. And actually the greatest lesson and value comes from when people have made those mistakes along the way, and then what they've done to recover that position, and then what it's enabled them to go on to. So I do think there's massive value in kind of sharing and learning from the mistakes that we've all had.
love that. And what mistake that you've made in the past would you be able to share?
Well, I'm not sure we've got long enough on this podcast, if I'm completely honest.
I'm going to share one. I'm going to share one of mine, right? So this is a story I tell quite a lot, and it was in the early stages of my life and career. So my first job was with the Woolwich building site. Do you remember the Woolwich?
Mm.
So it was in East London, in a branch of the Woolwich that eventually got bought by Barclays. And I remember getting my first pay slip and going into the branch manager and going, you know what? You've taken £54 for my pension. I definitely don't want to do that. That's 2 nights in the pub. I'm like that. That was my comparison. And funny enough, Jane didn't say no. She said, "Okay, yeah, if you want to do that, Grizz, that's fine. But you need to go and check it with June, who was the financial planner at the time." And I went in to June and said, "June, look, this is I'm 19. This is 2 nights in the pub. I want this money." And she looked at me, Katie, and went, "You're not going to do that." I went, "Oh." She went, no, and I was a bit scared of her, to be honest. I was a bit intimidated. She went, "You're not going to do that, and you won't thank me now, but you'll thank me in 25 years' time."
Yeah.
And weirdly, I saw her son about 22 years later in Tesco's doing his shopping. I went, "How's your mum?" Now, she didn't remember the fact that she'd helped me avoid a really super expensive mistake. She just didn't
Yeah.
remember it. But for me, just having that person at that stage of my life turn around and go, this might be a good move if you just let it take the money automatically and build, was
Yeah.
really interesting. But without that support, I would have made a really expensive mistake, I think.
Yeah, and actually, I think there's a really valuable kind of lesson there as well, isn't there? Around that almost ally, that sort of financial ally that you have in your life, or role model, or whatever phrase you want to sort of deem them, but that person that does sort of grab hold of you when you're vulnerable or when you're going to make that silly decision,
Yeah.
to just sort of also just give you some of their learnings
Yeah.
and share some of that, as well. I
I
think that's so powerful.
didn't have that at home. So actually having it at work was a really sort of powerful lesson. But it does make you think about what you teach kids as well, right? Because
Yes.
you want to make sure. So yeah, tell us, like, if there was one lesson you've learned from one of your mistakes, what would it be?
It probably would be to listen to the people around you,
Yeah.
because irrespective of their ages or who they are, as a role in your life, the likelihood is they will have experienced something themselves, and therefore when they're giving that guidance or sort of sharing of those stories, it's coming from a good place. So I think for me that's probably a really standout valuable tip around, don't keep your money worries, or perhaps something you don't understand, don't keep it yourself for the fear of sounding silly or because you've made a mistake. You're far better to just reach out and talk about it with people in your kind of immediate sort of network, or who you're comfortable to do that with, because the likelihood is they are going to have some really powerful lessons, learnings, or insight, that they can give you that food for thought. So
Yeah.
that would definitely be, for me, around some of the value that can come out of those stories, I think.
I mean, one of the things that I write about in the book, in the What Happens Next book, is about who you want in your team when you're thinking
Yes.
about planning and preparing for the next stage of your life. And one of the things that one of the people that I think it's important to consider is somebody who's already been on that journey, who might be 2 or 3 years in ahead, because
Yes.
not only will they have insights into making some of those financial decisions, they'll also have a bit of insight into the emotional journey you go through when you're making that transition, which my experience tells me a lot of people underestimate. What do you think?
Oh, hugely. Yeah, hugely. I mean, some of the work that we do at Better with Money is to sort of help people. We call it sort of retirement insights,
Yeah.
and sort of very typically cover those three areas around, firstly, and what does that mean, for you, and that transition you're going to go on, and that sort of change in your mindset. Obviously the money, because we then know that that's super important.
Important factor. Yeah, yeah.
But then to sort of sum up with that whole well-being piece around, for many people, when they think about retirement for the first time ever, it's their own 50 or 60-hour timesheet a week, to fill. And what does that actually, look like? And you're right, Chris. I think that it's so easy to get, bogged down in the, have I got enough money, to retire on, and what does my state pension look like, and what do all my other work schemes, and wherever that income's coming from, and pull all of that together. But how often do we actually sit and think, what do I get from work now? My social circle, the status for some people they may have,
Yeah.
just the purpose, in their life. And suddenly, that's going to go unless you're going to continue with some form. So I think that emotional piece is, and that transition someone makes is huge, and it's definitely not to be underestimated, for sure.
I think it's really interesting that, and I think it's the right thing to do to have a financial plan. Clearly, I would say that I'm a little bit biased,
Of
but
course.
the element of having a bit of a transition plan about the other aspects might be
Yeah,
useful too.
yeah,
And I think the and I think there's like a number of different component parts that you could look at. The big one that we're experiencing a lot when we're having conversations with both clients and guests on what happens next is that social element you mentioned.
Yes.
So it's like, I'm spending all this time at work. I get a lot from the personal connections I have at work. What happens when I leave? And we had a guy who worked for Lloyd's of London for many years and found himself in retirement going back to Lloyd's of London and doing voluntary tours. Now, he enjoyed the experience of teaching and helping others learn. The challenge he faced, he told me, is that when he went to the office and said, right, I'm ready to go to the pub now, they'd say to him, Andy, we're still working. You've done your voluntary tour and you're done. But actually, it didn't break the social connection. They're still friends, but the dynamic had changed. And I think often a lot of people definitely underestimate that. But let's think about the financial side of planning for that next generation. When you're educating people on that, what process do you talk them through to help them understand what they should do so they're ready for their own what happens next?
Yeah, well, I think it is sort of helping them to sort of list out, what do they like about the stage they're in now? So is that perhaps they're already play golf, as an example, they love travel, they've already maybe got one grandchild or so. So it's helping them to understand what's sort of good about life now, but then in the same respect, let's do a column around what don't you necessarily like, and what's sort of not motivating you and what's becoming a bit difficult, and then helping people to sort of understand where they're at now, but then potentially, where they could get to, and then starting to think around, okay, so let's say tomorrow you take the decision that you're going to put in, that request and say, that's it, that's me gone, I'm leaving. Essentially you are voluntarily putting yourself in unemployment, at that moment in time when you make that decision. So what does that then look like? How are we still going to take everything that's really motivated you and inspired you and help you to continue that moving forward? Because like you said, that social piece, and I mean, here's a story for you actually, Chris, and for the listeners, but we had a employer that we worked with, very large sort of manufacturing firm, and it's fair to say that the bulk of their workforce were lifers. That's all they've ever known since leaving school, and obviously they've built brilliant friendships. Arguably, to a point, these people have become probably more like family, to them, because they've spent more time with them, in work than what they have their own families in some examples. Anyway, somebody had got to the stage where they were retiring, and they retired. And the really, really sad fact was that individual kept coming back to the gate of the factory every single day when his pals would basically be starting their shift, just to say hi to them, have a quick chat, and then off he'd go again. And that was a real eye-opener for the employer to say that actually, even through retiring, that individual's lost a massive part of their routine and their social circle and their friendships, to a point where they are even coming back to chat to the staff at the gate, to see their pals, and there's real sadness in that. But actually, it really highlights that we can all curse, of our jobs day to day, but we do get a tremendous amount from it over and above, just the salary.
I so interested in that. I think the other element that really highlights, and I don't think we talk about it enough, to be perfectly frank, is if you're building additional social bonds, that takes time. And we think of retirement as a one-off event. We're one day we're there at work, one day we're not. Actually, I think planning and preparing for the stuff a little bit in advance and turning around and going, okay, I've got my financial plan, or I've not, and I need to build my financial plan. But what happens, as you say, when I've got my X amount of hours a week spare and all of my friends are still at work, who do I spend time with then?
Yeah.
Because the challenge you've got is your man you talk about. One day he's spending time with his friends, and one day he's not, and they're still at work. So he can't. Yeah, it's such an interesting one. If you spoke to that guy 2 years before he retired, what would you recommend he did?
I think it would come back to, what we mentioned earlier around, let's have a chat, or you have a chat with your kind of friends and network around what is it that you do actually really enjoy, about your place of work, so that then whilst you're here, how can you almost start to replicate that in your outside world, ready for them when you transition, and have that extra time to do it. I mean, there's an interesting comparison as well here, thinking about it, that we can probably make to COVID, because we saw a sort of pandemic that meant people suddenly lost their networks and needed to be housebound and not mixing and, maybe working from home and everything else. And, it's fair to say we've seen, a ton of research now that's able to come off the back of that to highlight some of the challenges from a mental health, perspective that period of time has had. So, I'm certainly not putting retirement in the same kind of category as a national pandemic, but it's still, there's some similarities in terms of we could be putting somebody into a situation where they actually feel really quite detached and isolated.
Yeah. I think, there's two things that spring to mind. There's a book that I absolutely love by a guy called Dr. Robert Waldinger. And Bob Waldinger's research, he's the lead researcher on the Harvard study in the States. And what that did is look at 80 years across generations, and he hasn't been running it for the 80 years. He's the most recent custodian. But it looks at 80 years of people's lives and really looked at what factors most improve well-being over a lifetime, not just phoning somebody up and saying, are you happy? What is that over a lifetime makes people consistently happy? And the interesting thing about that study, it's really, really clear. And, having enough money is a factor, and health is a factor, and all of that sort of stuff. But the underlying factor that drives all of that is the quality of people's lives are, on the whole, determined by the quality of their relationships. That the factor they found to be the most impactful in terms of that. And I think, yes, having enough is important, because without money as a tool to live the life you want, it then doesn't enable. But I don't think we talk enough about how much that social well-being is such an important factor. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. But moving back to that money side, if somebody was in their 50s and 60s and preparing for the next chapter of their life, be it retirement or whatever they plan to do, what steps would you recommend they take to get ready?
I think sort of visibility really is key as well. So I think, sort of almost doing a little bit of that initial, sort of fact finding on yourself around, right, what have we got where? So let's dig out. I mean, we always sort of refer to these sorts of things sometimes as the paper detox, because we can all be guilty of having that pension statement maybe come through the post, or a bank statement, and it kind of gets flung into a top drawer or filed away somewhere because we've got that comfort. We maybe don't need to look at it right now. But actually, I would really, really recommend that people make a date, kind of with themselves or with a partner, sit down, dig out everything. So out comes that shoebox of shame to kind of flick through all of the paperwork, open up any envelopes, lay it all out on the table to really then start to have, an overview of what is our actual worth? What do we have where? Requesting a state pension forecast, all of these good things, really useful tools. If someone hasn't done it, to start doing, in preparation for what have we got now, but then, where do we need to get to? Because people that are in their, 50s are potentially in a really fortunate position as well. But it's never too late, it's never too late to be able to actually look and think, is there something more, we could be doing? So it's about then using, what time is left to be able to think, okay, maybe that changes our plans a little bit, but we've got the opportunity to be informed now, and we can actually try and make that difference, or at least, put some effort into doing what we can,
Love that. Why is it the shoebox of shame? Why? You're right. I agree. By the way, yeah, we have all got one. And I absolutely agree that getting clarity and visibility on what you've got is the right thing to do. The bit that fascinates me is why is it that shameful act to get clarity? What is it? Does that come from the? I don't know is the answer, but does that come from the fear of actually having to face some really hard truths that what is it?
I think there's two things really here. I think firstly, when we look at anything money related, it's far easier for people to bury their head in the sand. And I think statistically, we see that through, particularly with debt. And, on average, people will typically tend to be in a situation on debt for up to 2 years before they will sort of bring their head up out the sand and tackle it face on. So I think that's quite natural that, as individuals, we prefer to bury our head in the sand and than actually need to sit down and face something. I think secondly, as an industry, and for someone that's sort of been in financial services now for 23 years, we have done an incredible job of totally overcomplicating things and embezzling people. And, even with all the qualifications in the world, there's still the odd, document that, and Chris, I know you'll identify this, but we have to look at and think, what is it here that we're actually trying to say to somebody? Because it's very, very confusing. And I think when we then expect people that perhaps haven't been, sort of in our industry or have had that level of training to interpret that, to have to open maybe some of these statements as well and figure out what it is that it's actually trying to tell them is also quite off-putting. So I think they're probably, for me, two key areas as to why people then see it come through. It's recognizable that they maybe know it is their pension statement and think, I feel so far away from that, I'll file it and I'll look at it at a later time because I don't know that I completely understand some of what it's telling me.
Katie, I'm 1,000,000% with you. I mean, we as a profession and as a financial industry, do we make it transparent enough? Do we make it easy enough to engage with? And the answer is probably no, right? And I think we could do a lot more to do that. But the interesting thing, and you alluded to it just now, is that element where we, even in our 50s, it still feels a long way off. I'm not retired yet, so I'll worry about it when it comes. What can we do to get better at, living our lives today and living our lives in the way we want them today, but just having one eye on that medium to long term? What one tip would you recommend for people to do that?
Yeah, probably I would say for me, it's around how people then perceive, those kind of investment vehicles, so to speak. I think because, again, we talk about it as a pension, for example. I think that then slightly skews our thinking around what we picture and how we then view that. Whereas I think, really, if we sort of tell ourselves that really this is just a long-term investment vehicle. It's just a long-term savings vehicle that's invested, that has some tax advantages, but then it's going to support me down the line. And when it is going to support me, there's actually some flexibility that's actually going to come with that as well. So I do think sort of the name pension probably doesn't, necessarily engage people, attract people. So for me, that would be my top tip around just not thinking of it sort of fast forwarding what that's going to kick back at the end, but actually seeing it as this is something I'm actively involved in now. It's a long-term vehicle that can get me to my dreams and my goals and really visualize that. I have lots of conversations to say, how do you see returement? What sort of images
what life do you want to live? What life do you want to live? I suppose that, and this might be an individual thing. I'm not convinced. For many people, retirement, the old concept of retirement, is particularly attractive either. People want, my experience is, people want the reduced pressure of less work commitment, but as you said, probably fear that period of life where they've got no purpose, meaning, or drive. What do you think about the concept of retirement, and how do we redefine it in a way that actually is appropriate for people living their lives today?
Yeah, I think it is interesting. So I think, and as I'm sure you've seen, Chris, as well, that definitely is changing now in terms of, what people are going on to do. I think the days of people sort of handing in that retirement to their employer and, it's stopping dead in its tracks in terms of, that's it, that's me done. I'm not seeing that as much at the moment. People are already, having conversations with me around, I kind of see myself doing something self-employed, or they love gardening. So, they're like, actually, I'm going to continue to garden, but I'm actually just going to charge people in my local area. And then that will help, keep me active, some money coming in, but also I've still got the other time hand. So I do think naturally we're starting to see, that change in terms of balance,
right?
Life after work as opposed to retirement, and
stop and rest, I think, is what people, it's really interesting. One really fascinating thing, and I don't think I wrote about in the book, but I've certainly talked about on the YouTube channel in one video, is this: often we psychologically really struggle with identifying with our future selves, because it just, it doesn't feel like us. Our 20-year view doesn't feel like us. And there was a company a few years ago called Postcard Financial Planning, which used to send their prospective clients a postcard with a photo of the client they'd sent in, and then an aged version of that client. And they used to say, you're not doing all this planning for you now, you're doing it for that person there. But with the benefits of technology and the use of AI, you can actually just produce that image yourself. To be honest, Katie, I did it and it made me look a way more smart than I actually am. So I need to redo it.
You made me intrigued now. I'm going to have to go away and play around.
Well, but actually that element of thinking about the future you and the ability to visualize that with the touch of a button using technology is an interesting framing technique, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I love that. Yeah,
I'm doing it for that future you. I'm going to send you that photo, and you won't believe what it's done to me. Honestly, it's made me a lot cooler than I actually am. I'm really curious about the topics, the financial, because you mentioned the shoebox of shame. We've talked about the emotions that come with thinking about some of these conversations about money. What money topic do you think we choose to ignore the most? And why do you think it's important to face that topic?
I think I think it's probably investing, the topic of investing. So anything that typically then lends itself to being an investment vehicle. So whether that's, stocks and shares, ISA, pension, anything that's got that kind of underlying. For me, I think they're a large proportion of my conversations where people say, I just feel terrified by it. I don't feel I understand enough about it. I don't, and I think again, even when you get people talking and you say to them, if I spoke to you about investing, what image comes in your mind? And it's always, really similar around people saying, people in suits, typically men, kind of Wolf of Wall Street, all these same examples sort of come up. And then when you sort of are able to demystify some of that and say, well, actually, you are already an investor, because let me talk to you about your pension, or let me talk to you about how your ISA is currently working. You just sort of see this relief that they're like, wow, I'm an investor and I didn't even realize, because it's something I feel fearful. So for me, I definitely think it's a massive topic that people, sort of avoid or ignore, but is one of the most valuable opportunities, people have got, certainly for their mid, and longer term planning. And for many people, they're already doing parts of it. But if we could help them to kind of understand it, build their confidence around it, it would only lead to people having, greater financial resilience and security.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the gap often is just knowledge, isn't it?
Yes.
It's that once that, and you've alluded to it earlier, Katie, that element of if you don't know something, it's scary, but once you get clear on where you are and how it might fit into your plan, that then can sort of work really well for you. And certainly, that the alternative of not investing in something is you're less likely to achieve the goal you plan for the medium to long term. It's just like, if it's in cash, it's probably going to take you longer. So it's really important to consider. I like to frame the conversation we have on what happens next in particular about financial well-being, but I do worry a bit about that phrase, because it's thrown around, and often there's a risk that because it's thrown around and it can mean anything, it becomes meaningless.
Yeah.
What does financial well-being mean to you, and how do we make it real and tangible in people's lives?
Yeah, so for me, it's financial well-being is a state that somebody kind of experiences, and it's about feeling in control. So being in control would mean around that sort of financial resilience. So what is someone's ability to absorb shock, or unforeseen circumstances? So, that kind of short-term planning, have I got enough in my bank account to have 3 to 6 months of my essential spend put to one side, so that if the boiler goes, if the car breaks down, I'm can cope with it.
Yeah.
Then I think confidence is a part as well. So then that's where the education kind of comes in, and and how we help ourselves kind of build our confidence through the learning and understanding what it is that we're part of, and just being really clear, Chris, in all honesty, about our money now and in the future. So for me, it's those three components. It's kind of control, it's that confidence, but it's also that clarity, on their money for the short, medium, and long term. To me, if somebody's able to do all of that, then naturally they'll have a positive, financial well-being.
Yeah. And as you said, it's a state of well-being, but based on practical actions you can take, because you can boost your control, you can boost your confidence, and you can boost your clarity. What I'd love to understand is if somebody was going to take one, we love the concept on what happens next of the incremental low-cost experiment. So the idea that you can turn around and go, what's the one tiny thing we can do to just inch ourselves forward in that area. So if you were sitting in front of somebody who was in their mid-50s and asked you the question, what's one small thing that I can do to be more in control, what would you recommend?
I think it would be that make a date with yourself to be clear on what you've got now, what you see, what you visualize, and then what's that gap between
Set
them.
that date. Set that date. Yeah,
That's
love
it.
that.
Yeah. So make a date with yourself.
And then I suppose the other interesting thing, I mean, I think about making that date. Kaz and I do it together when we make that date. We do it on a regular basis. How important is it for you? And it's interesting when I think about the work we do with the clients, because there's some clients who are really comfortable with the dynamic of speaking with family, and there's some clients that aren't. I'd suggest that doing it with the people closest to you, your partner and in your family, is probably a key step. What do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree. And actually, I do think, again, through sort of, doing various money coaching or conversations with people, there can be a lot of secrecy that sometimes comes, with money, even between partners, and like you said, you can sometimes see that uncomfortableness around, no, because then they'll know how much I spend, on my catalogue, and or maybe the other partner saying no, because then they'll realise quite the extent I go and play golf, or how much my clubs cost, or whatever else. So sometimes there can be sort of a level of secrecy that goes on financially, but no, I would always be an advocate as well, of saying you have to sit down and come at this together, and understand warts and all, really, what's going on financially.
I mean, despite my deep embarrassment about how much I'm actually spending on paddle tennis at the minute, Cassie does know. Cassie does know. Tell me about, we're talking about actions you can take and stuff that you can do to have a positive impact. What do you reckon is the one most single impactful thing you can do if you're in your mid-50s, making change right now, that's going to move the needle the most?
I think it is knowing what you've got. I do think it is that kind of, it's very difficult to plan or visualize if you don't know what the reality actually is. So I think it is as hard as, and I get it, it can be very, very difficult, but I do think it is having it all out in front of you, or even just writing down, what balances are sitting where, and then actually bringing that all together. What does it look like? Because, and I'm sure, Chris, you've probably had these experiences as well, but on a real positive, it can really help people as well to think, actually, I'm in a much better position than what I thought.
I mean, I love conversations where, and this isn't always the case, Katie, but I love conversations where people come to me and go, I want to get clear and I need a bit of help. It's like, great, okay, let's do that. What does enough look like for you is the typical starting point. And that might change, because it typically does. So I had a conversation yesterday with somebody. I run a monthly inner circle group with other professionals, and we talk about this sort of stuff. And I was running that yesterday, and the interesting conversation kicked off that actually you might not know how much you need in the early years, and it does change. And I mentioned the fact that yes, it does, but just that enough number will change because you have experiences that mean it will.
Yeah.
But just having a number to aim for means that you can get clarity on what you're aiming for. But the bit the conversation I love is when people come to me and go, I don't know whether I've got enough, and they're really close or they're over enough.
Yeah.
Because that gives them the freedom to turn around and say, I can use the commodity that's actually the most finite, and it's time, isn't it?
Yes.
How do you want to spend your time, and what do you do with it? But I think we also need to appreciate that this conversation is difficult for a lot of people. And if you were sitting in front of somebody in their 50s and 60s and saying, we appreciate it's difficult, but is the one thing that you should remember from this conversation, what would it be?
I just think they're not alone, as well. Sometimes I think you feel that you're very alone in those situations and you're not, and you've got a good, strong network around you that will be able to help. You've got professional roles that you can obviously go and speak to as well. But yeah, just not taking it all on your own shoulders and feeling there's nowhere to go in understanding that. And that would be my sort of key.
When you're having conversations with people about money, do you find that they feel that it's their responsibility alone and they take it on their shoulders? And why do you think that is?
I think they probably do, and then I think they feel very, I think they feel very anxious around the fact that they are sort of carrying that and not really knowing, where to go with that information, because sometimes, maybe they don't need financial advice, but they're still in that sort of guidance, kind of area. And again, I know that there's huge steps coming, from the industry around being able to support that middle ground piece. But I think that's probably what the challenge for people is, knowing if it's not quite at a level where they need financial advice, where do they go and what does that look like?
Great, that's a great question. Where do they go? Where would you recommend they? Because I agree with you, it's probably the minority that need financial advice as opposed to the majority. So where do people go if they're in that middle?
Yeah, I think for now it probably is looking at things like, you've got the Money Helper website from the government, which, again, it has got tons of sort of factual information only. But again, that signposting, that can just help people read around, that subject in a little bit more detail, and then sort of signpost off, from there, because then at that point, they've probably got themselves to a more informed state where they think, yes, actually, I do need advice, or no, I don't. I've got enough information and I can make this decision on my own now by just chatting it through with family or friends.
Yeah, and I think the more people who get that sort of level of knowledge, it's better for them to make that choice. Now, you've told me a story about the guy at the gate. I want to talk and finish with a positive story about the amazing work you do. So, what story best describes the work you do, helping people increase confidence, clarity, and control with their money?
I think it would probably be arguably actually when somebody's been in debt. I think giving them that opportunity to have spoken, through that, and to then be signposted on to where they should go has for them, and in their own words, has been a lifeline, and has really, really changed their life in just being able to lift their head up out of the sand and get some of that support and some of that signposting. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the value and the power of just talking these things through. And certainly from a Better Money perspective, that's been so valuable to support employers for their people in giving them that space to be able to talk. But I think for you and I, Chris, doing the work that we do, it is such a privilege to be able 100%. To chat to people and help in any way we can.
Yeah, 100%. And I never take for granted, Katie, the trust that people place in you with some of these important decisions. I think it's really, really important. But I 100% agree with you. That element of, with a particularly sensitive subject, sharing that problem with all of the elements of guilt often that come with it, and an emotional burden. Like if you can help somebody just by sharing that problem, going, here's some practical steps you can take. Sure. I think that's amazingly useful. Where can people find out a little bit more about you and the brilliant work you do?
You can go on the Better With Money website and have a look. So that's www.betterwithmoney.com, or I'm on LinkedIn. And yeah, very happy to always, you know, chat to anybody and share like minds as well.
Amazing. I've loved today. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Chris. Thanks so much.
Absolute pleasure. And I hope you've really enjoyed that. Have a lovely day, and we'll see you on the What Happens Next channel soon.